things. And I think, that's very cool
Yep.
for our students to understand that sometimes we actually get to critique the architect and, what was that dynamic? And then if we can make it all the way down to, you guys talking a book.
That to get the architecture you were interested in, so that touches the phase you were describing, and then it goes to the actual building of the project. And on detailed landscape architecture.
And then Joe was saying it goes on beyond that to Bow Canmore Highway and Mount Kiska ski area. And we don't have any of those drawings here, and I guess they're probably filed under a different project name or something, so we don't have those. But maybe just a reference to that at the end, depending on where we get to. Okay.
Didn't you, after you had the master plan done, didn't you represent the province in selecting the hotel operators and do the financial analysis and all of that? Did that come before the final design?
No, it came after the design was prepared and the developer package sent out, and then we responded to that over the course of several years as that all got together. And
Yeah, I think
then there was more architecture that came from there
Right.
as those guys proposed.
Do we have any of the developer package? I think those sketches up there were from the developer package.
Yes.
I actually might have the developer,
It's-
some of the developer packages. Are you
it's
talking
a-
about the purple book?
Yes.
Yeah,
I got it.
yeah, I think you
Richard,
mentioned
does this come maybe before this in terms of
Sorry.
talk?
Majority, I'm gonna say very little in this. I'm just gonna remind him what he did.
I don't know if there's any one of these that you prefer, maybe the colored one stands out the best. And you get the new bags.
This was actually after we got the project.
Was it?
Yeah. This is way more detailed, but this is good.
Well, I remember they were,
About
I remember they looked almost relieved when we started talking to them about how the process worked in the different phases, and they seemed almost relieved that somebody had a handle on how it might unfold, didn't they? If I
Yeah.
recall.
All right, yeah, this is, still got 3 villages on it.
Okay.
I'm gonna put these in hand, so if you
Okay.
get ready and you wanna do those first or whatever, but
Okay.
just jump back and forth.
But the key thing, we need to be talking about various things that are part of the archive here as we're talking about it.
Well, there are so many other stories that go with it that we need to know as
Yeah.
well. And some of those, though, I can catch at another time. We can record them on the phone or whatever. That's why it's really valuable to have things wherever we can tie in things from the archive.
Okay.
But yeah, we want to know the whole story, how it started and went from something originally small to something much bigger, and then back to site planning. So. You ready?
I'm going, I'm just rolling, so.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's good.
Well,
to know.
that makes a fine introduction.
Well, yeah, Richard, we're pleased to have the Kananaskis Archives as one of the pilot projects here at the USU Design Workshop Archives, and we'd like to really avail ourselves of this opportunity of you and Joe Porter being here to try to give us an overview of what went into this project, what it meant to the firm, how it started, how you got involved, and the whole storyline. So we'd appreciate your just sharing with us.
Well, we'll share as much as we can remember for a project that, first of all, spanned about a 10-year period of time. And when you see the size of the project, that seems pretty unusual. But that was sort of the challenge of a project this complicated, which was driven really by a series of political forces in the beginning, caused by great prosperity in the gas and oil industry in Alberta, which was rich, and the province and its legislature decided that they would elicit this severance tax on all the gas and oil that was being drilled for in Alberta, and use that to create a legacy of recreational opportunities for that citizen and that population group. And it was particularly driven because Banff National Park was world famous. It's a world heritage site. And in it, there were a lot of restrictions about how future development would occur given its national park status. And Alberta's general feeling was, that's great, but we need something for Albertans, something that engages people and connects them to the natural world, has a wide range of recreational opportunities, and we want to develop that kind of a project. And one of the real kind of key factors in this whole project for us was that some of the legislature of Alberta had gone to Europe, and they had traveled around Switzerland in particular, and coming on the trains, they would arrive in these valleys of the Alps and would see Swiss villages, one after the other, set beautifully in the landscape from the 11th, 12th century. And they came back from that trip really motivated to describe that experience to be brought to the Canadian Rockies. And so that was put together in a policy statement called the Blue Book, and it was an absolute policy about what was going to happen in the Kananaskis region for the future. And it described multiple outdoor recreation, but more specifically, it described 3 villages not to be larger than 150 units each. And these 3 village sites, and the program behind that was the starting point for them seeking consultants to help them plan and create this recreational opportunity, of which we became notified, became part of a team, and were ultimately selected to do that work. And we had described at that time the experiences that we had in Colorado and other places about how destination resorts responded to the environment, to program, to economics, and what it meant to develop a project like that in a remote location. And so we wrote quite a logical work program about how to go about successfully deciding what program ought to be there and how you would identify the uses and the people who would come and benefit from a recreational development like this. And the province at that point had already succeeded in building 36 holes of golf by world-renowned golf course architects in the valley. And they had subsidized it to the point where the private equivalent might be $100 a round, and they were subsidizing it so that every Albertan could play for about $15 a round. And so this idea about provision of recreation was very high on the political agenda at the time. And so they wanted a complement now of these villages to help support people coming out and recreating, the golf being one of the really highly developed parts of it. So we organized with them a planning process, which is what this diagram was. It spoke to how you would start by identifying an analysis of the region to find out where opportunities and constraints were relative to development, and how to match this recreational program they had in mind with the particular land that was available in a very large valley. But the valley had this characteristic of being utterly remote. It had a single road in it, had been built, but the entire land had yet to be surveyed. Even it was an area that had not had very much intervention by people. And so this flow chart begins to describe going from a general plan to a more specific series of sites, talking about the issues of how you would recommend the right strategy for development and implementation, how each of these pieces of the project from Village 1 through Village 3 and some other ideas would be put in place, and how you would go about designing and programming each of these. The other
Richard, was the request for proposal for that initially, what did they ask for? I can't recall what they asked for initially.
They wanted someone to design the villages.
It was the village design they were asking.
That's what they asked for.
And And we explained to them you needed to do some work first.
That's right.
Yeah.
And with that, the other part they were very clear about was that the province was going to make the opportunity available, but they expected the private sector to be the actual developer of these 3 villages. So they had seen it as a partnership, but they didn't want to spend taxpayer money to accomplish the actual development. They wanted to create the opportunity, and particularly the opportunity that did not exist in Banff National Park.
And Land Plan contacted us about this, didn't they?
Yeah, in the land plan at that time, a small Calgary-based landscape architecture firm, Todd Johnson, was working for Land Plan at that time. And Todd Johnson ultimately, many years later, 20 years later, joined Design Workshop and is a partner today.
But you all know who Todd Johnson was. He went to
course.
school here, and his brother was Craig. And so it's a pretty tight-knit group of
Yeah.
people. And they called us, I think, at the last minute and said,
That's right.
we've whipped together a proposal.
So,
And I think the province might have delayed, readjusted the schedule when they got our initial proposal. I'm not sure. Something happened.
you and I got on an airplane, and we
Yeah.
had something like 4 days to complete it. So we went up there, we went to the site, looked at everything we did, and we just put our nose down and wrote a proposal and submitted it, and then got on the airplane. So, the,
And it was part of this proposal then to step back and take a broader analytical look at the entire valley and the land sensitivity.
we described ways in that proposal for how to evaluate this larger landscape, this whole valley, to determine where the sites would be.
And then I think that caused them to, I think the first proposal was for the village, and once they saw that, they kind of reevaluated, and that's where the change came.
Right.
Because there was a later work program, I think.
What was so disturbing to them, actually, and the committees that were in charge of creating this project had already done a number of their own site selections. So we had written to that as a need, but they had already gone out with helicopters and looked around this whole valley to find the 3 sites. And so one of the first things that happened in the process was to go out and see where these sites were. And one of them was very close to this area called Ribbon Creek, which was a plateau lifted above the valley where the golf course was. There was another one where the helicopter had so little space that it actually had to hover while we got out. And we stood there, and I said to the director, "Where is the site, and why did we land here?" And it was virtually rock cliff on all sides, and the amount of usable land was about the size of this table. And the second site had similar problems. It was in avalanche paths, and it was on a delta area that was extremely active geology. So we left after those first site visits realizing that even though the legislature had seen these sites and blessed them, that we had a serious effort in front of us to really define where these recreational facilities ought to be built. So that's when, to Joe's point, we broadened the scope and described to this committee a process in which we would evaluate probably 100 square miles of landscape to try to find where the best sites were. At that same time, we also had economic consultants were working with us, someone we had a great deal of trust with and experience with from Colorado. And he was making a very significant point, which is small 11th century villages of 150 units each was not the pattern of development that would satisfy the economic needs of today or be even the least amount successful in the marketplace. And so he was challenging very strongly the idea that you would divide and conquer these sites, and he was really suggesting that a single development site would be the most effective way to do this. So that was the second major challenge to what was written really strongly in this policy blue book. So because everybody who had been involved in this project felt so strongly that they had identified in their own minds the right places and the right style and the right number of villages, we said, we really need to look at this broader landscape and we need to take you through an analysis of what would make good development sites and why. And we could demonstrate to you very important land criteria that we could use to make these sites together. At that time, what we commonly think about is GIS overlay analysis done on a computer. It hadn't existed. But we took the methodologies in which we asked this group of people what they thought made good sites. Divorce it from a particular landscape.
Here, grab those maps.
What are the things that would make a great site? And this series
Take
of,
that beanbag on.
this series of maps took, which were all done by hand, but were created in a way that the transparency of these Mylar overlays allowed you to build up several layers. So in the conversation, it became clear that steep slopes had lots of limitations to these recreational sites, and by witness of that second site we landed on. And so the group said, well, we do think that steep land probably isn't the best. So we did maps in which these overlays were created, making and weighting the elements like slope very, very heavier than the other elements. This valley is subject to kind of enormous winds in the middle of winter, and these winds come up and down the valley, and if you're in an exposed site, the ability to recreate here is diminished dramatically.
There's a ski area up there that we visited, and all of the lift towers and all the buildings have cables on them. And we said, what are all these cables? And they said, well, it's pretty windy here in the winter. So that was the first indication that wind was an issue.
Here are actually some of your data maps,
Yeah.
Richard, that you might.
We, there were questions like, would you like to see the development from the main road, which they had just built? And we asked them, and then we mapped these conditions, and the consensus of the group was, no, we did not want to see new development on this road that had been developed for recreational driving purposes. So we mapped all those areas that were invisible from that roadway. There were lots of geologic conditions that affected it. There were geology conditions that were hazards and we knew would be difficult to build on.
Really serious. And by the way, Richard finally, we asked them for geologic studies, but Richard just finally took the aerials and based on his education in geology, just mapped those conditions. And
But depth of bedrock was a big important thing because in this valley there were absolutely no services, there were no power lines, there were no sewer connections, there were no water wells. So finding bedrock and then finding the kinds of sources that make it possible to service the kinds of projects we were talking about were important. So we looked at what makes infrastructure expensive. Crossing of major rivers. So that really indicated on one side of the river you would be looking at half the cost of the other side of the river because of the bridge crossings and utility crossings. We looked at depth of groundwater, and this geologically had very high a graded river in the bottom of it. Groundwater was everywhere. Up above it was dry and well drained, and so we were really looking for sites that would be the most favorable for construction, particularly foundation, and not be affected by groundwater. And we systematically went through everything that this committee had talked about making one of these sites good and why they had selected them in the beginning. And then created these maps that went through infrastructure cost, went through human comfort, went through the suitability of the landscape, went through visual considerations, overlaid them, and finally summarized these maps into two general categories. The first was, if you take all these things that you've said are important and we overlay them and we weight them as you've described, where does that geographically come out to be the best? And this map summarizes that there were lots of reasons not to build in very much of the valley, but this was the site in the center that we began to focus on and recommend because it had the conditions that they had described as being important. And then the alternative to that was, where would the environmental sensitivity be most prominent? And this was a map then that looked at the habitats that were there, the water quality conditions, the vegetation communities, visual quality, and we were describing in this series of analyses that if you built on the darker part of this blue map, the consequences to the environment would be the greatest. And so the two patterns, here's where building based on your criteria would be the best, and here's where the consequences that would be considered negative to the valley would be the greatest. And we built didn't have a way to really project this, so we built a plexiglass stand for this presentation, and we put it up with a Kodak carousel projector behind it. So it was like a vertical light table. And we went to the meeting with all of this on the table and put up one layer at a time over the top of this, building it up until the end of the presentation where we described how this would go together. The committee said, we see where the site is. And in that moment, it was kind of crystallized why this committee felt that they had to reinvestigate all of the policy and the desires of the legislature. And they came to the conclusion that the site at Ribbon Creek was the site that they were going to use. And so the next steps were to develop these alternatives for the legislature, because there were villages, there were roadways, campgrounds, expansions to the golf courses, wildlife viewing areas, lots of different recreational potentials that they wanted to get the feedback from the legislature on. And we took these alternatives and we prepared them, showing how they would go together, including the original one from the policy statement. And this committee and the staff group took it to the legislature with one message, and it came back as if the legislature had not had the same information. It was the most bizarre, pass it through the wall to the legislature and come back, and it went in as cheese and it came back out as bananas. And we sat around collectively and tried to discuss, what did the legislature mean? And were they looking at number 5, but they really wanted number 2? And so there was this impossible communication gap that had been created. And at that point in time, the committee said, we have a legislature that doesn't understand what we're trying to do here. We've got to find a way to put them on airplanes, get them to other resorts and other places that have created these kinds of recreational places, and talk to them, show them, provide a method of educating what it is we're talking about. And so that's exactly what we did, and we landed in Jackson, Wyoming, right from Calgary, got off with six legislators. And by the way, the other thing that had been described in the policy is there would be no commercial space allowed, no commercialization. So we picked them up at the airport, and as you come into the Jackson Square, there's a lot of quite exciting retail space. And I stopped at the red light with my carload of legislators, and while we were stopped at the red light, they, on both sides of the car, got out in the intersection because they'd seen stores that were so interesting to them they weren't even going to continue to our hotel. And so we let them go, and we rounded them up, and I said, I don't understand why you got out of the car when you don't like commercial space in a resort, but you all got here, and before you'd been in this town more than 10 seconds, you were out of the car shopping. So explain to us how your program choice reflects many of the kinds of reasons that people go to these places and the needs they have. So that was the beginning of a lot of discussion then about the recreation and re-visualization about what the policy should be. And we continued to do that through multiple parts of the process and ultimately got them to see many, many Western resorts and learn from and see what it is that they were interested in doing. So after the alternatives phase, we resubmitted it. We had a great deal of clarity then in the message, and we were able to get through this first step, which is how do you look at the region and how do you look at the regional recreational plan that would be applied here. And it came back with a very, very different set of parameters than where we started. And at that point in time, we got to the level of confidence to say, we have a site, we have a program for it, we need to move to the next level of designing the village site that's going to be the accommodation base for this whole region. And that process was then one of, a first.
Should we roll out a large plan of the village side, or this point where you want to
This
talk about some of that?
How large of a site plan would you like? We have like the great big one, or we have smaller, less colorful renditions.
Well, there were, it's kind of a segue into how many renditions of a plan could you do? And the reason this project has so many site plans is that there was a great desire to try to find the most optimum site plan, again, threading through the policy that had been established. And the way we went about it is we had clarified what programs, what need, what type of hotels would be here. They had come to the conclusion that this would all be, have to be hotels. There would be no private ownership allowed. There were commercial space opportunities that occurred as a result of some of the trips. We started by putting together a design team, having a 3-day charrette at the site, visiting the site, and then working together. That included architects that were part of this project. Bill Johnson came and participated with us for those 3 days. We had a pretty comprehensive group of designers from Design Workshop who had interests and sensitivities and everything from the environment to more detailed design. But it was really, how do you organize buildings, uses, public open space in a way that would make this an attractive place to be? And at the end of that, we examined, and some of these exist in the archived examples of some three-dimensional sketches that ultimately were not in the final form, but they began to breathe life into the character of this project. This one called Ribbon Creek, Mike, is kind of the second one down. Yeah, that drawing there that this, for example, was an illustration that was not specific to a particular plan, but illustrated more of the concepts of how pedestrian space lined with shops would be an attractive place to enter the village, and how those services might be picked up in the idea of an active ground plane and then residential space above, and the process of describing what scale and mass of this village would be. And so that's a sketch that is a character developed sketch rather than a particular part of the village. There were other sketches that tried to bring out and identify for decision making some of these pieces that were never put together as part of the site plan. Nonetheless, we end up taking these 3 sites, the common open space, the parking, and all the other parts, and assembling this village plan around a low spot that happened to be part of the glaciation of that area. It was a large block of ice that had been retained, and as it melted, left a depression. And that was the center part of the site plan, and became ultimately a small water feature that is in the center of all these diagrams.
In that water feature.
The second thing we felt pretty strongly about is that the trees that were up there on the site ought to be preserved, and so the idea was that development would be as if it had dropped out of a airlift helicopter and landed on this landscape without the evidence of construction, because, you know, there is just no tree growth in this region. It's very slow, and so to have a denuded site really wasn't the right approach. And so much of what the village ultimately ended up doing was saving large masses of trees very close to the buildings and spaces. And that came about right from the very beginning.
You want this one?
Yeah. But this first site plan organized a periphery access around the outside. It had 3 particular hotel sites of varying sizes and quality incorporated. It had a central plaza, this recreational use lake in the center, a recreational building that was really available to the public, and had it as a program, a lot of activities for bad weather times that would be incorporated there. And then a walkway system around the outside of the village. Yeah, great.
Let's put a small Richard.
Yeah. This would have been a very early sketch of the village, still with the idea that greater amounts of uses and program would be an important part to create more vitality and more purpose and more critical mass for the people coming here. And this conversation continued for a fair amount, because there just was a very small amount here, given who it had to service and the remoteness of it. So the dilemma on the table was, how do you get people to go to a place that doesn't have enough interest and activity when you're really close to places that do have those characteristics, like this town of Banff.
Let me ask a question. The village there that was ultimately built, a relatively small village, you think it would have been better, larger?
There's no question in my mind that that would have been the case.
Yeah.
It was too small to make it as interesting as it should
could
have
be,
been.
yeah.
And there weren't enough people, there wasn't enough accommodations, in particular, there weren't the things to occupy people in a vacation experience like this. You know, the diverse outdoor recreation part of it was strong and a great attractor, but it needed something more than just being in a place of extreme beauty, which is what this site was. And we always felt that the program was not big enough and not comprehensive and complex enough to create the interest of making it a destination on its own right. And, you know, having visited there afterwards, I think it was quite clear that there wasn't enough. And the fundamental costs of the infrastructure and so forth would not have changed dramatically. It was the concern, more than anything else, that this would become commercialized and become inappropriate for the place it was.
Could the landscape itself have accommodated a larger facility when you talk about dropping this into the landscape and preserving as many trees as possible? Were there enough additional buildable sites, or would you have just thought about making the density higher in this area?
Well, I think both of those things. There was lots of land. It wasn't an issue of not having enough usable site. It was, and this program would have been 2 times or 3 times larger than the one that they had selected. And it was, again, a test and a tool to help generate, you know, a good decision about how big the village should be. And density could have been increased and would have been a far more interesting place architecturally if there hadn't been a pretty strong arbitrary cap on the size of the buildings, which was 3 levels. And, you know, great places have lots of diversity to them. You don't find all 3-story buildings. You find focal buildings, and you find buildings that are less important and lower. And many of these other schemes that you have in the archives are, again, explorations to help understand how you could create more design interest and more program interest by sort of eliminating this arbitrary cap of 3 stories. Yeah. So there was ultimately a resolution on the size of the project, the organization relationship of each of these buildings to the common open space, the arrival areas that were to be preserved in the village, the walkway and overlook points all around it that connected the village to tremendous views that were possible, an affordable housing and employee village that serviced this project, the access point, roadways, infrastructure, you know, basically everything that would be required to create the village. And that was defined to the satisfaction of the Alberta government, and reconfirmed again that the time in the project now was to find development interests who would come in and be the developers of each of these hotels. And the government had, for a long time,
Do you have the development package?
yeah, it's right here,
Oh,
had expressed just utter confidence that there would be people standing in line to do this, because there had never been private sector development allowed in the Banff area, which was, again, the model that people had in their mind for providing additional recreational opportunities. So, at this time, it was interesting that at Whistler Blackcomb, the government had done a similar thing where they had created a development opportunity, gone out with developer packages with very special kinds of definitions about the types of developers they wanted, and then had these developers come in and created Whistler Village. So clearly the model they were interested in. We prepared a developer's package, and we did it with the consulting team. It had elements of market and economics, a lot on the physical conditions expected. It was very detailed, particularly with the architecture and the physical design, because really it was concluded that they weren't interested in a series of motels lining the roadway, which would have been the development pattern they had expected. It answered all the risk questions about who's going to pay for what and what services would be available. It communicated the architectural character that was anticipated with materials, roofs, the building systems themselves. It was important in this detailed village to have a good understanding about how parking would be done, which was below the buildings. And so this developer package was put together, illustrated, and it was advertised widely in the province, and broader than the province. It was in the Toronto Sun and lots of other Canadian investment areas. And Canada had gone through, at this point in time, one of the most cataclysmic economic conditions that they'd ever been in. In about 1982, the effect of oil and drilling absolutely tapered down because of world demand, and so this flow of energy from the severance tax began to dwindle dramatically, and the economy more broadly was suffering a recession. And as this package came out and interest was being generated for it, it was just at the time in which these things were occurring. So ultimately, there were some responses to this development package, but it wasn't as if everybody had wanted to do it. There were a few. My recollection was there were 5 or 6 responses that came out. When those responses came back, we were asked to evaluate the capability of these developers and how they would go about it and how carefully their proposals had met the original. And some of those evaluations eliminated on financial strength some of the people who had proposed, but it had narrowed it down to 3 options. And those 3 options, as developers, could not have been more different. They were one was a larger corporation, one was a very small family that had been in the hotel business for a long time. Another one was a very sophisticated investor who had wanted to have a hotel in these areas. So this new chemistry of developers now were brought to the table, and development agreements were going to be signed with these 3 developers. And at this point in time, the design effort has diminished to nothing. There is no design to be done. What has to be done now is to assemble the correct terminology of an agreement for each of these developers. And as we sat to talk with each of the developers, they had numerous issues with the work that had been done, where the space in the hotel had been placed that was considered to be public space, issues about how you arrive. None of them wanted to be part of a village. They wanted separate, independent sites that they could organize and maintain and manage without consideration of other parts of the project. They wanted to not do underground parking. They considered it expensive and unnecessary. They didn't feel like the public ought to have a place in the village. And so there was criticism about the program that was there to help satisfy the day use need in the general public. And those are just sort of the beginnings of the iceberg. And at the same time, none of them felt the economic parameters offered by the province was suitable. There was going to be leased land, and there was a lease back arrangement which had been constructed, described in here. And given the economic changes that were occurring, what would have been a very good economic formula for them a few months ago was an environment that made it financially unsuccessful. And these negotiations, which were originally considered, we'll find the best developers, we'll get the package together, we'll start the village design and construct it on the basis of that, went into a completely different process in which each of these was being negotiated with, trying to keep the concept together. Became our largest role. We were the institutional memory, we were the keepers of the vision. We had to fend off a whole series of ideas that others who hadn't been in the process wanted to implement that would have been contrary to the success of the recreational village that came back at this point in time 3 years before starting with the policy blue book. And we just met with all of these people to try to contain the idea and show the alternatives. And once again, we put everybody on an airplane and we did tours of destination resorts so that this wasn't an abstraction. It had a tangibility to it, and lots of other people's success that this could be used as a model. And so the drawing you see in front of me is a drawing that came about as we unsuccessfully were working with the architectural design team of the largest hotel, and they would send drawings which had flaws in them in many ways, and then we responded to those architects and to those developers with alternatives and other ways to think about it. So these are actually overlays of their buildings, describing what the real intent of the physical design of buildings would be. And ultimately, to the point where we actually developed the openings, the articulation, the facades of buildings which they had done, which tended to be more like buildings you would find in apartment complexes in the city. And that really wasn't too surprising afterwards, because there had not been recreational development in this area, in this region. And so there weren't people who were skilled with the building type or were skilled with the real issues of how you build in a landscape this mountainous. So snow issues, for example, nobody even thought about in these early designs. The choices of material tended to be focused not on making a place in a mountain landscape, but they were materials that you would find more in an urban place.
We noticed in going through some of the archival drawings that we actually, some of your comments and critiques discussed the roof overhang and where the snow would fall so that you could create outdoor passages and protect pedestrians from avalanches off the roof, for instance.
Right, and that caused this group of people who had been selected to be developers huge amounts of angst, because they wanted people not to walk between buildings in a village sense. They wanted them to stay in their hotel. So this idea of connecting the lower levels with arcades for pedestrians that were covered was really counter to their vision about how these hotels would operate. So we got into lots and lots of discussion about village versus individual.
While we're talking about elevations, I'll roll this particular drawing out, and maybe you can comment on whether this was a transitional stage or was this where things finally began to arrive at.
Well, many of the ideas here on this sheet, this was a transitional phase. It was an attempt to, as this thing was going in a really unproductive way, to try to bring together the thoughts about what a village meant, how multiple buildings tied together with relationships together would be a stronger idea than this sort of retreat to the individual separate lodge or accommodation. And so we did these drawings to help show the benefits of the village and how this became a single project as opposed to multiple projects, but there was variety and individuality in the design that was possible. But in the whole, it would be a village scape and a village place, and it would remind people of the ideas that were the government's from the beginning, which is we want these unique little recreational places that no one else actually has, that are village in scale. And so, articulating village green and the size of building was part of what this set of drawings was about. And in a way, it was a design management tool. It was a way of communicating to everybody what it could be.
How did you get around all of that?
It resolved itself successfully and unsuccessfully. There ultimately was a point in which these guidelines that were written, the intermediate work, the overlays or critiques, the combination of input from architects that were not working for the particular developers, moved the design in a very positive way, particularly in the materials and so forth. It fell short in creating extraordinary architecture. It was a process of moving a boulder uphill as opposed to an inspirational one in which this idea had been collectively enhanced by everybody. So we didn't have some successes, and we moved it in a lot of ways. One of the things that was such a struggle was, rather than focus the food and beverage and retail around this village plaza, everybody wanted it at their front door, so that only their guests would be responsible for it. And one of the hotelers had made great inroads with international marketing, particularly the Japanese, who found this place to be the most attractive place to visit in the entire world. And so their food and beverage was entirely sushi bars set up around bus travel, because it was organized around 42 people per bus. And that was the business model, the travel model, the tourism model, and they had no interest in anyone else participating. So that was a enormous challenge to an idea that had accepted broad Albertans, not busloads of Japanese. And this conflict was wrestled with between the government and these selected developers. And at one point, one of the developers said, it just isn't going to work for me. I don't like this concept. I'm withdrawing from the project. And, by the way, in the meantime, the financial climate is so bad that this project is not financeable anyway. So, one of the three people that had been so instrumental at this point disappeared entirely. And that meant trying to replace that development entity with somebody different.
Richard, I'd like to interject something here. In part of this process of arguing your point for the village concept, one of the fascinating things that we have in the archive collection are a series of sketches done at various points, and wondering, looking at these particular sketches done over what appear to be wireframe computer generated drawings, are these some of the kinds of things that you were doing perhaps to reinforce your argument to picture the village, to help people visualize what the village might look like on the site? And could you lead us a little bit through what these very interesting drawings are all about and how they came to be?
Well, yeah, you're right on all those topics. It was the need to describe in three-dimensional terms and communicate in this negotiation that ensued was a critical thing. The illustrative drawings there were done to illustrate the potential and what the concept was. These were drawings that are a lot more focused on individual design issues, like how does an arrival relate to the front door of a hotel? And as I described earlier, that every one of these hotels had their own set of physical issues that didn't match what the idea of the village was. About that same time, we had investigated and lots of other projects, and Joe was particularly focused on how do you, as a landscape architect or someone interested in building projects, truly represent buildings in the landscape and do it accurately. And we had searched for lots of methods. We had taken photographs and drawn over existing photographs. We'd floated balloons. And we floated balloons to get the building heights and the positions of the building correct in relation to the background. And oftentimes we would do it in the slightest wind, and as you would try to photograph these balloons, would start to lose 2 or 3 stories and be bent over like this.
Yeah. Finding a calm day in a windy valley is a little tough.
We tried doing a set of graphic overlays to depict different parts of the village, trying to find the right base plane to start with in these graphic illustrations. And at that time, I'll relate this because Joe probably won't remember the intensity of this experience, but we had been involved in the snowmass community with a very well-known architect, MLTW, which is Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull were active in that firm at the time, and they had been commissioned to design a condominium building on a steep site. And they had done a beautiful design, and they had illustrated that design, and part of our role was to take the site plan and the architecture and move it through a community process to gain acceptance for it. We represented the project with extreme confidence and passion that what we were designing and showing was the way it was to be. And ultimately it became accepted in the community that while bigger than they hoped for, it had a lot of other attributes that made it a worthy choice. And so that project was built and didn't think much about it. And we went forward in Snowmass with another site. It was a companion site near the same kind of view. And as we started to talk about that with renderings, as we had before, the town planner reached out from under the table and he pulled the original drawings that we had submitted with the architect showing that. And he had marked the actual size of that building, which was now there over the top of the rendering. And we had demonstrated the rendering to be about 2 stories too small. The architects had, and we had believed it. And in all frankness, there was no method at that time to more correctly illustrate it. It is complex topography, complex building put over the top. And so that became one of the great reasons to try to look for other ways to do this. And we had gone to Hollywood and we're looking at some of the animation programs that were,
Called Lucasfilms and asked them to do give us a proposal to simulate Owl Creek. And they did, and they said it would be about $100,000, and we said, we were thinking 5. And they said, get an Iris computer, that's what we use, just do it yourself. So we spent $40,000 for an Iris computer, $5,000 a month for a consultant for 2 years to show us how to use it, and train somebody.
so the Iris computer, you have to appreciate in the world in which user-friendly computers and programs are known, this was an absolute jet. It was an F-18 of a computer, and it arrived, and
It was used to do the first Star Wars.
we're a little landscape architecture firm thinking we want to apply it, and we say, wow, we really made a good decision here. And so these were the kinds of products that we got started with. They were wireframe graphics, and this would go back to about 1980. There was no application of computer simulations to the built environment. And these little sketches, wireframes, were used to create first a general massing of the building and a layout to explain to lots of these audiences that we were dealing with. And then we relied on our hand-drawn methods to take very quickly these wireframes and draw over the top of them. This happens to be Don Enson's drawing,
Yeah.
where literally in a 30-minute effort, he could create what the computer couldn't at that time by adding shadow and light and the features of landscape, which gave us this methodology to talk to these groups that were very adverse to one another at this point in the process and be able to describe the village more correctly and focus in on individual design questions. So these wireframes, for us, we became utterly fascinated at how the detail of three-dimensional simulations would enlarge our thinking about a site plan.
Yeah, these were done from, I think these were done from the wireframe.
I got a chance.
A car driving by reflected in the dinosaur's eye, and we said, it's time to
It's
stop
over.
this.
This is it.
You guys are taking this to a level. And but we had 3 irises and 3 operators, and we were spending a lot of money.
It became fundamental. It was a fascinating cultural dynamic about the separation of a high specialty from the purpose. What started out as an idea, we need to have every bit of visualization capability we can on a complex project. We have so many audiences and nobody can read a plan, which I fundamentally believe today it is so true. Nobody can read a plan, including the people who are drawing. And without these tools, it wasn't possible. But because the iris was so sophisticated, in order to run that, we had to hire computer operators. They were people from a computer science background. And they came with wonderful technology skills, and they came with a focus about a machine. And we ended up with a culture in our office of these special computer guys who could not communicate with the people who were in the design firm. And they would sit there with earphones and a screen in a dark room. And one day, looking at this thing going on, as we looked at each other, he said, have you ever talked to one of those people? Do you know how to talk to them? Did they ever come out of that place? And that became known as the Bike Cave.
Yeah.
And it went on and on with this utter disconnection between how we wanted to end up using visualization tools, the process to create them, and the people and their personalities.
There was a time when it was really useful. When we'd sit down with a client or we'd sit down with architects and they'd say, we hate that. And we'd say, this is a simulation of your building. So, well, we hate it. Well, it's not the simulation. It's not our fault. And so we had some good times. But then it got to the point where everybody had these. Everybody was doing slick animations. They were sales tools. And we said, you know what? Let's get rid of the irises and let's start just invest in getting computers on everybody's desk and start to build the capability for the designers to use this as a design tool. We quit using it as a design tool because it was getting too sophisticated.
Well, you bring up an interesting point when you talk about it becoming too slick. And one of the things that's actually refreshing about these quick drawings is the fact that, you know, they have a design quality about them. You've taken that step where you've had the computer generate accurate dimensions, which gets around the problem you had with the earlier project you talked about, Richard. So you've got the accuracy, but then you still have the hand element of design. And to me, that's something that's missing with SketchUp today and other technologies, is that it's so easy that we tend to have lost the thinking behind it. And,
Yeah.
and that's what I really value about some of these early works.
I thought the other part that was, in my memory, was so great about this was almost an instant response. Once we had the SketchUp model built, the Iris model built, and we had flown through it, we had the capability of setting up these choreography paths so you could arrive by car, you could come as a hiker, you could walk through the village itself and, you know, see how water was integrated into the plan and so forth. Then we ended up just using this almost on a SWOT basis because it was issue driven. You know, somebody said here, I don't like the way the entrance to my hotel works. And we would draw that front place, we would show what the issue was. They had in their head a different issue than physically existed in the master plan, and we would sit down there almost on a moment's notice and say, you know, this is the way it is. And they would say, oh, it's not what I thought, but what I don't like when I actually see it is X. And so this dialogue, a visual dialogue, was created as part of a business arrangement that was trying to be hatched as these developers were getting close to becoming close, you know, getting these development agreements in place. So the village kind of continued with this in and out of the developers, nobody confident that the project would succeed and no one having confidence that they could move forward and be a real developer. And during that period of time, which was economically driven, but it was also because there were so many different viewpoints about what this place should be as a destination resort, this extraordinary event happened, which was Calgary applied for the 1988 Winter Games. And rarely does an event in the world change people's perception of how the future is going to be modified. And that spurred on, first, the need for all the Olympic venues. So downhill skiing, cross-country skiing, the luge, bobsled, a new transit program and light rail system in Calgary, a Olympic celebration plaza that regenerated parts of downtown Calgary. All those sites and those selections were going on in the midst of this. And there were proponents for every one of those features, and every previous Olympic skier from Canada had an opinion about the success of one place to the other. And so one Olympic skier would say, it's in the next valley. That is the best new ski area. And at this point in time, the province had hired us, retained us almost on a retainer basis to help make all this make sense into the recreational concept that would exist after the Olympics. And we sat in rooms with people coming in to describe their site and why, and I watched powder skiers come down these slopes on sites all around these villages. And it was the most perfect ski conditions you can imagine, with Olympic quality skiers being delivered by helicopters. And they end the presentation by saying, there is no better site, and we've proved it by looking at these skiers. And they'd leave and we'd say, well, if that site is selected, there is no resort infrastructure, there's no accommodations, there's no utilities, there's no afterlife for a ski area built at the far end of the village. And then there were other proposals that moved up and down and around this valley. And one that came to be was called Mount Allen, and it was the site that was literally 2 miles away from the village that had been planned. And the dormancy of our village project was huge. It was in a complete no man's land. The government was directed now to figure out how to get the Olympic stage. The developers here never reached satisfaction that was going to work. And all of a sudden, the Olympic fever had taken over all of Calgary. And so we studied Mount Allen, we looked at Mount Allen, we were consulted on how these existing plans might affect it. It wasn't the best ski mountain in the world, to be completely honest, and it was suffered from things we knew about from the very beginning of the regional analysis, which were these horrible winds and winter winds that would come through. And so ultimately, a political decision was made and Mount Allen was selected. So suddenly the interest now in the village, we've got an Olympic ski mountain being built from scratch. We got these golf courses that were already there. We have the village site in this limbo, but planned and ready to go. And the developers changed completely. They said, this is such a successful project. We want to be part of the village. And so the task turned then to delivering all of these things in time for the 1987, because the World Cup races had to occur a year before the Olympics. And it appeared that there was a very, very strong motive here, and the economic impetus, and the Olympics brought all the focus on it. The economic problems had ameliorated somewhat in Alberta, and the Olympics now just became the new driver. And so we started this process up in earnest, and the foundation had been laid, and development agreements were put in place. But the part that sort of separates from planning and landscape architecture was that suddenly there was a new problem on the horizon, which is nobody had leased Crown land. Crown land was the way in which the British Crown had transferred Canada. And lands that did not have specific ownerships were called Crown lands. And this valley was a Crown land. And so we had to figure out a way to make it possible to lease Crown land to these developers, and under what terms. And that got us working with the Attorney General's Office of Alberta to find the basic way in which land could be transferred, and under what condition, and what mechanisms would it be. And what had been done before is the Crown lands had always had very short lease terms, and then they would come back to the Crown. And here we were expecting people to spend millions of dollars of private investment, and they were not going to turn the land. They wouldn't do that investment if the land had to return in 30 years. And it was even stronger because in Banff, that land system allowed no private ownership. It was all leased land. It had to be leased because you had a reason and a purpose and no alternative to be there. And they were short-term leases. They returned, I'm probably wrong about this, but I think they were about 40-year leases. And then they had this renewal option. So we sorted out the legal and community ways in which services would be paid for and developed and back charged, and how a resort association that would cover this whole region would be organized and what its governance would look like. So we got clearly organizing out land and governance. We had no government here at all. We had no authorities at all. We had to create those authorities. We had to form the basis to develop. And that was the next step before the allocations of the public side of the money from Alberta went forward and construction began on the infrastructure side.
And we brought resort developers, people we had known who had created those kind of documents in US resorts to Canada to tailor them to Canadian resorts. So, you know, in the Toward Legacy book, we use this project as a project where everything came together. A lot of things Richard has talked about, we had done incrementally in various places, but this was the first time we were ever in a position, because it was a public client instead of a private client. We were in a position to really coordinate these things at various scales in one project.
I'd like to roll out
The
this
landscape.
one large, call it site plan.
Landscape plans.
Richard, we need to respect your time and get you out of here soon.
I'm fine. I'm good till 5, for sure.
It's upside down for you.
He knows it.
Big. So it's been interesting hearing all of this conversation about the larger issues and dealing with leasing of land and all of these issues that we tend to not think oftentimes that landscape architects get involved with, and then we come to this drawing, and I think a lot of people relate maybe more to this, students of landscape architecture, as being, yeah, okay, I can relate now, this is what we do. Does this represent now a point where you've finally locked in the location of buildings and you're moving ahead now with more traditional detail site design?
It is. This was the culmination of the pieces of the building with those developers' design teams, the footprints, the allocation, the programs for each of these buildings that had generally been resolved. As I look at this, the building here, the health club building, was the idea of one developer who just could not accept this health club being part of the hotel. And so in this plan, we're still debating whether or not it ought to be in front of the dining room or not. So what they basically did is say, we're going to move the dining from where it had been allocated earlier. We're going to put a health club there, and we can't do that. We're not going to do the project. And that would have made a dining room with no view. And so we were still in that category of trying to help conclude the right set of conclusions for every one of these developers as opposed to a single developer. And so at this time, though, this starts to represent the integration of detailed landscape architecture, the shapes and forms that were there, the paving choices, the way entrances would be marked and brought into sequence into the project, how outdoor spaces related to the uses inside, where the synergies of energy ought to be placed, and ultimately, because there had been no budget up to this point identified, we had to budget the public infrastructure part of this village at a very detailed level, because it was going to be an allocation of funds to create the development incentive for these various projects. So there was a lot here that gets into details of budget that then turned into contracts. And the planting palettes, where certain plants and forests would be saved, how the landscape treatment, there was a series of meadows that are just off the page that were part of the development, how those were going to be revegetated and what their physical appearance was going to be, were kind of important issues. And then by this time we had developed a series of complexity in the design about making level changes work so that you could move around this entire project without going through stairs. And so it was all about landscape architecture at this point. It was grading plans, it was water and drainage, it was planting, it was paving materials, it was lighting, accent, sort of bringing the look and feel of how these spaces would operate. And it didn't seem like that would be so challenging in the beginning, but because all this use pattern from inside the building went through these various phases, you originally might have an outdoor dining area, and then ultimately that was connected to the lobby, not the dining room. So, coordinating how indoor-outdoor relationships were organized was reflective of where we got to with this drawing.
I'm fascinated by this whole story, starting with the beginnings of the project and going through all the different iterations, the economics and everything that went into it, and then finally getting down to this point and trying to understand how one person like yourself sort of can transcend all of these different levels. Is this something that comes easily? Were you personally involved in every one of those levels, right down to this detail level? And how does one wrap one's head around that transition from thinking legalese down to thinking the beauty of designing a fountain?
There was a complete stream of involvement from the start to finish at all these different scales. And I'd comment that design is fundamentally at its root problem solving. So whether it's a regional problem solved or a fountain problem solved, the materialization is different, the issues are different, but it's problem solving, going from an idea to the reality and tangibility of it. But the real truth of it is there are lots of other people who had stronger skills at these levels that participated. And, at the regional level, the geologist input was critical. At the programming level, the economic people input was critical in determining what was the right program economically and what was physical possible. At the governance level, there were people who had built governing structures, meaning here's the organization, this is what it has to deal with, it has to address this. And at this scale, there were landscape architects with great capability at the site design and landscape architecture skill that were very much part of the project and brought that layer of great design and feeling to it. To keep going down that step, there were people the civil engineers, who understood the stormwater management and the methods by which we would manage the stormwater for this project that were not the traditional way that people had done it in 1980. And there were people who knew about the horticulture of this forest and the forestry issues surrounding the site. And there were people that knew about trail systems that helped us think about and conceptualize the way trail connections regionally would tie to the village and how they might be done to interpret parts of the site or expose people to things in a different way. And there were transportation people. But the role we ultimately played in this is the coordination of all those individual efforts into a point where it could be constructed.
Manage the process beyond design management. Design management is typical, but this one went beyond design management.
We probably should wrap up now anyway, because they shut down at 5 and you need to.
One thing, as long as Richard's here, I'd like him to comment on.
Yeah.
We got a little bit longer, Mike. I have to hit right at 5:20,
Okay.
so you, another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Fine.
Based on this introduction and relationship with the province, a couple of other projects came along. Why don't you just quickly provide an overview of those? Because this led to even a further expansion of this
Well,
management.
one of the things that happened when you work on a project for a very long time is people begin to either trust you or you get fired. We
true.
had gone through this process with Travel Alberta, which was the tourism development arm of the government. And we had developed a good relation, a lot of trust with those people who were the staff people. And so they started to understand as this project moved forward, they had lots of other tourism questions and issues. And so I think one of the first things we looked at was further down in this valley, a little neighborhood node. It was a service center because there were no services in that end of the valley, but they had built recreational parks and so forth. And they asked us to program a service center. And then there was an interpretive plan that came out, that they realized that they had lots of opportunities to connect people to this landscape. And then there was a put and take fishery. And that was truly interesting in its own right because it was the result, it was an area that had resulted in some of the cut and fill for the golf course. And they wanted to create a very biotically correct and rich environment for fisheries. So we worked with them in creating the right environment in this lake to get insects back into it and regenerate it from what was left over from the cut and fill operation. And then they started to get concerned about a series of large industrial kinds of uses on the corridor into Banff National Park, sand and gravel and lime extraction. And so we did what became an ASLA award-winning project, which was the corridor to Banff National Park and the visual consideration of what should be allowed in that and how you might manage it. And by this time, we had developed greater sophistication in computer modeling. So we had modeled futures under certain management strategies. And well, what if you use, the existing zoning in this corridor? What would it look like? What if you allowed the expansion of sand and gravel operations? And there was never a debate whether or not those were valuable. It's just, were they the right place to be on the entrance to a national park? And so the Beau Canmore visual analysis was a highway corridor study looking at land use implications visually. And ultimately, we were asked to, or we were in this region and there was an international competition for the Downtown Banff Enhancement Program. And that resulted because Banff, the management of Banff had left Ottawa as a federal management technique and become its own municipality. And we won that competition and did the downtown plan for Banff. And then we were hired by the sand and gravel operation that we had said not to expand because they had a resource they had to deal with, and they were looking at different mining techniques that wouldn't have the visual impact. And we ended up creating strategies to mine sand and gravel in this region, but not these sheer walls that they had done, and then put in place the reclamation as part of the sand and gravel operation. So this project led to many, many other questions of tourism and the balance between how you develop and how you preserve landscape. And
Dealing with really Western issues,
Yeah.
Rocky Mountain issues. We were working for the quarry beforehand, and they fired us when Richard did that study, and didn't give us any. We were getting along great, and didn't give us any response. And then when the study was over and everything had settled down, they hired us again. And so, I think somebody asked what happened, and they said, "Well, we knew what you were doing. We knew what was going on. The home office didn't. We were instructed to fire you." So we did. We rehired you.
And Joe, you had mentioned also a ski area, mountain plan.
Well, it was Mount Allen I was thinking about.
Oh,
It was Mount Allen.
as Mount Allen was getting ready to be constructed, we did some consulting on the site planning, but they took that into its own realm of, they did kind of a planning effort, and then they hired people to construct it. But we had hoped to get a much stronger connection between the ski area and the village, and even at one point in time, there was quite a bit of discussion about relocating the village to the base of the ski area. the solution we had thought might work would be the lift connections, the non-auto lift connections from the village to the base. But those parts did not figure very heavily into the Olympic idea. And so they never actually were realized.
If it would have been a bigger village, I think there would have been a
There'd been a lot of
connection.
reason to do that, but,
Yeah.
you know, when you have an opportunity to think about the region, you think about the objectives, and you think about the design and the programming of individual sites, this idea, the preconceived idea that started this project became an enormous hindrance to what would have been the right kind of project to build. And we struggled with the size of the village, the commercial of it, the fact that it had to be hotels, the fact of the size in terms of height. And these things were policy statements that didn't have the context to understand how they would create the physical form or development form. And throughout this project, and I would say today, those are the things that were the most challenging and didn't get resolved correctly. You know, if you had thought about this without the European village model and the limitations that were created by what Banff was, and the fear people had of recreating Banff here, you could have designed a more beautiful place, a more wonderful place, a more interesting place, and a more economically successful place. But that was a policy out of context.
And yet, that said, it has to be incredibly gratifying for both of you and for the firm to go back to this area and realize the impact as an outgrowth of this project plus the highway corridor and the downtown Banff transportation plan and all of, I mean, it becomes a regional sort of stamp, and you can go there and feel good about what you all have done.
Well, by the way, this is a neat little place.
Mhm.
And the whole recreation area, the whole area is enormously successful. I mean, it's really did what the province wanted. But if you add to this the work in Flathead County, which is close by, and the work at Whistler Blackcomb, there's a whole band of work in southern Canada and in northern North America, or in northern United States, that kind of fit in this area, and it's had a pretty significant impact on that area.
Great. Well, thank you both for your time, and
Pleasure.
I know, Richard, you have to run, and
You've got 3 minutes.
Thank you, guys. It's really quite interesting to look at these things, which many of them I have not seen in 30 years. Kind of rolled out on the table, and it's fun to explain it and to kind of revisit and why that happened when it did. And you know, we were laughing the other day about how these social forces influence design in so many ways, and I hadn't thought about this horrible recession in 1982 and how it was affecting the oil industries. And you know, this had been a city that was just pumped up on every bit of gas and oil that they had available. And the tar sands in northern Alberta were vast projects where they were flying people into these remote locations in 737s and had complete construction camps as this
Yeah.
extraction industry was wild.
We could go from Denver to Calgary hourly.
Yeah, there were flights.
Wow.
It was Houston, Denver, Calgary, and
Yeah.
these flights were just
Yeah.
packed.
You could walk out there, you could get any time, and a year later, there was a flight a day.
it had dissolved, and you know, the effect of that on ongoing possibilities and initiatives that people had wanted to do that had been financed by these special taxes was so challenging.
This walkway, by the way, is this the one, Richard, that has the stream along it?
No, here, this one right here.
That goes out, but doesn't it go out to the edge? Isn't
Well,
there
yeah,
water?
it does connect, but this goes out to the viewpoint. This is the one that goes along this little pond.
It's really a beautiful walk.
We have some images from your files showing that. It's it's gorgeous. Okay. Well,
Thanks.
thank you.
Mike?